How about now? Is that better? Anything? I'm trying a couple different audio things. Always audio on this laptop. I don't know what's up with that. Uh, if anyone wants to just kind of confirm. Oh, yay. Hi. Hi, everybody. Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to try to start the other thing back up. Uh, okay, audio now. Okay, cool. Um, yeah, I think it had something to do with the fact I'm trying to do the dual the dual stream here. We're going to try this one more time because some folks have requested it to be on the Facebook. Can't make everyone happy, I know, but I'm a sucker. All right, so anyway, while I'm trying to set all this up, how's everyone doing? Feel like it's been a million years. I know it feels good to be back in New York. I'm doing a little bit of self-isolating right now, being from coming back down, I should say, from New Hampshire. Um, uh, Mostly fine. Everything's good. I'm feeling great. Um, New Hampshire was uh, New Hampshire was nice. It was very quiet up until the last day, which was the beginning. They had moved Motorcycle Weekend, and my hometown, which I've dealt with this my entire life, is about 10,000-ish people tops, spread out over a very large area. So peak normally 10,000 people. In the single weekend, there was going to be estimated over 130,000 people coming into the city. So I'm glad to have left when I did. We hit mega traffic. And I got to see some family that I have not seen for a very, very long time, which is the only reason that I went up during the whole, because of the whole pandemic thing. I have some family that are on the older side, the elderly side, and um, it was every year is kind of the, uh, is this might be one of the final opportunities I get to see this person. So that's, so it was really great. Got to see everyone. The families, extended families, getting really big. There were a lot of babies this year, um, so that was interesting in the mornings. And I got to practice a lot of swords outside, so that was really great. Um, it is delightfully, what's that word? Cold. It gets really, really brisk. It gets very, very brisk up there at night. It was fantastic to sleep naturally in like 50, I think it was like 50 degrees every evening. Oh, so good. Thank you, Dina, for covering class. Always glad to have more. Always glad to have more Messer content, and I think it would be one of the things we're going to be trying to do over the next few months. I think it's time that we start trying to do more in-person classes. The statistics and data has been very, very good in New York, and I think everyone is very keyed into what the best practices to keep everyone safe. So what I would like to actually recommend, and this is something that multiple people have asked about, instead of doing evening classes, Dina brought up a really good point earlier that it is getting darker earlier, noticeably, sadly. Good night, goodbye, sunlight. But it is also kind of gets in the way of people's travel time. So the idea has been floated by actually a number of folks, possibly start doing weekend classes, preferably something on Saturdays, because that would kind of fit our more usual normal schedule. There might be a couple weekends where I try to do Sunday, but that's kind of up in the air. I have another study session that I work with on Sunday, so I don't want to do too many swords on Sunday. I personally cannot do too much. Maybe we'll see. I have a scheduled appointment, no swab test thing, just to be sure. I've been feeling fine. Um, Long story short, I'd like to start setting up weekend classes, like Saturday classes in person, so we can start doing the Ratten in person and Messer, Longsword and Messer with Ratten for now. Um, Again, until we get some insurance and some safety stuff taken care of. Oh yeah, and Hildo is looking to do a sword and buckler group. So if you're on the Discord, please pop into the sword and buckler group and get help get that conversation going. Don't worry about equipment. There is plenty of loaner gear that we have been working out best practices for having loaner gear now. Let's see. Uh, and let's see, what else? Other announcements. This Friday will be a normal online class. I might do it over the YouTube instead of the Zoom, simply because it's a little easier for me technology-wise. And I also wanted to ask people, in terms of class on the weekend, either class on the weekends or Friday Zoom sessions, are you interested in having both a longsword and a messer component, or is it more okay to kind of shift them around? I personally like, messer's my big thing. It's where I got my started kind of doing instructional stuff, or study group leading and stuff. So I'm always interested in bringing that further. And I really miss doing more of those. I miss those classes a lot, so I'd like to get back into that. But I also love longsword, and so I want to make sure to kind of provide both sessions for both. And yeah. So if people are interested in doing yeah, that might be a thing as well. I was thinking of either doing 2 classes on Saturday, so there'd be a messer class and a longsword class, or doing kind of like a half and half kind of class with maybe like eventually when things get better, some Gekken things. Hopefully, if things are better, we'll have space to slaughter cats. Yeah, I think that's it. Does anyone else have any Hema-related announcements, or know of any kind of either online stuff or any other big events kind of coming up? Yeah, I think Lacey. Yeah, I think I'm leaning towards doing 2 on Saturday, doing like a double class thing. Especially like ideally, what I'd love to be able to do is have like a longsword session and then a messer session where we kind of explore similar things with different length weapons. Even though the kind of curriculum I have for both of those weapons are different, I think it would be interesting to kind of see where those overlaps are and where they are not. Also, might be fun to have a couple days where it's mixed weapons. Um, uh, Additionally, what else? Yeah, ideally, I'd like to be able to do both. In a single day. That way, people, especially folks who are traveling a long distance, we can make kind of an early afternoon of it. And again, I think that we can be safe in our sparring practices, and eventually we'll be able to start doing Gekken. Speaking of which, does anyone know whatever happened to the Gekken order? I know there was a collection being taken up a million years ago for purchasing some new Gekken. Has anyone heard about that lately? All right. Well, if anyone hears anything or knows who I should talk to, let me know. Um, let's see. All right. So announcement stuff out of the way. One of the things that I wanted to do was talk a little bit about the idea of unbinden and häwen. I got to probably ask Matt. He's been quiet online though. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I completely forgot. Yes, you're right. Matt was helming that, and we should definitely reach out to him to kind of see what the status of that was. Um, One of the things I'd like to eventually do for the Messer group is get like a little set of the Gekken Messer, because Messer Gekken, I don't know what the right way of saying it. Sorry, sword. Um, Messer Ken, no, it's sword. Anyway, padded messers, some padded messers, because the Miyazashi padded ones are really fantastic. Anyway, today's subject, or the brief little, before the AMA really kind of drives into free-for-all question mode, what I like to kind of call the kind of want to get the brains in the gear by talking about unbinding. Um, unbinding, on the bind, in the bind, and I think it's interesting because there's a really, it is actually a more controversial thing, or at least the interpretation of it is more controversial than I think a lot of people realize. A lot of schools teach unbinding as if you cut and you hit swords, and then some good happens, and then other stuff happens. And then other schools teach it more in the way of how do I say, swords crossing is more of the interpretation, right? And I think that's really interesting. I like to kind of look at it in both ways, and kind of, so what I like to do is kind of talk a little bit about maybe the pros and cons of either interpretation. In terms of um, unbinding as you got the right question on the Facebook side, I can't tell. In terms of unbinding, on the meeting of the swords, it can happen in a number of different ways. It can happen because you've cut and someone has parried, or it can come because you're both in, say, like Sprechfenster, and you have maybe crossed tips, or have gotten closer in the Zufechten, or in the Zufechten to your opponent. And what I find really interesting about both interpretations is that they both have a merit, and I think they both come across, like, and they both work in particular systems, right? Or kind of an approach, right? A lot of the unbinden in terms of when it's clash, and go, requires a very specific, very instantaneous reaction to, say, that coming to the bind, in which that there's not a whole lot of time that can occur for the art, the other work to occur. While something along, so you say cut and you have to almost instantly react. It's one thing when you cut earnestly, but then in, like, say, a practice session, someone's like giving you feedback. But what I personally find is when you try to do something, say, as a full cut, the reaction time is so, like, the OODA loop that has to get filled is almost too tight in order for some of the more complicated things to arise. That being said, it's not wrong, because it's a lot of, clearly people can do it. I guess part of my approach, my contemporary approach, partially comes from the fact that I have kind of now experience a few different sword schools, right, in different approaches, and as opposed to, say, so there's so like the kind of the other school of thought, which is like becoming two of the swords, is more of like if the swords are the swords come together but might not actually be physically bound. These are all like points of like endless online debates and scholarly debates and humor. But so, like, say the swords have kind of crossed, or maybe you see this a lot more with like rapier, where the swords are kind of coming in contact and people are vying for different positions. More psychological chess warfare than, say, like actual, like, big strong push pull. And so the Anbinden all of a sudden starts becoming about that moment of when your swords cross, having to make decisions based on the positioning and the pressure coming off of your opponent. I think both situations do arise naturally in fencing, so I don't want to ever say that there's ever like one true interpretation. So it's kind of, in many ways, good to practice both approaches. But what I find really interesting about the unbinden approach, the coming to the swords approach, all of a sudden longsword starts being handled more like a two-handed rapier, or hand-and-a-half rapier, in the way that, especially if you look at the type of swords that would be used for a lot of the fighting, and also early rapier systems, like Meyer rapier and some of the Palladini things, or Palladini's really smart. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But like some of the early rapier systems, there's still things like cutting and slicing. Thrusting is a major component of them. And in fact, a lot of the early Meyer rapier stuff shares a lot in common with the terminology with the longsword stuff. Sorry, losing my thoughts there. But like the longswords that we're looking at for the Lichtenauer material in style are closer to, say, like early, like a two-handed version of the rapier. And their design is more thrust, right? They're not, say, like some of the arming or war swords that are single-handed, and they're definitely designed for more cutting. You see that with like the Alexandria, which is more of a war sword, if it's even an active duty sword, so to speak, and definitely not a fencing or a dueling sword. And again, a lot of this is coming from my perspective that long swords were used for dueling purposes, not so much the sword of war kind of thing. Anyway, so the unbinden approach kind of treats the long sword more akin to a two-handed / hand-and-a-half rapier. And yet, all of the longsword Lichtenauer materials still apply, which I think is really fascinating, especially once you start getting to the idea of Streckfenster and how it is the most noble cigar and we're always kind of supposed to fight from it. So longsword then becomes this fight for the overbind. The noble war kind of becomes a certain style of fight for the overbind, so to speak. Yeah, so those are just some interesting observations that I found, kind of studying different approaches to, different approaches. And it's also interesting because having doing Messer study, they frequently talk about how you can do the same thing with a Messer that you can do with longsword, which I think is interesting because one can immediately think, oh, that means the fencing is the same. But fencing with a Messer is inherently different than we've normally been taught that with a longsword, because the Menser of a Messer is so much different. Especially a short person like myself, if I cut at someone, I'm in the minute I'm in range, like actually in range, it's grappling time, or like I'm in danger of being grappled, or I have to do something to prevent a grapple or some such. And so the Menser is greatly different. But what I think is being said is that you can fight with a Messer the same way you fence with a longsword, and vice versa, so that there is technical overlap there. Joe and I always joke about how the Kukner is probably the best longsword treatise ever written, because all that stuff kind of does work with a longsword, especially if you treat it like a hand-and-a-half sword. Again, it's not to discourage the cutting stuff. I think cutting is a very good part of Hema, a very good testing mechanism for a certain element, but it is not the all-encompassing thing. So it's like two different approaches that really. What I find interesting about it is that it's two different approaches to unbinding, which both inform to some degree, or informed by the greater approach of the individual taking to that study. And if you were to look at the unbinden in a way of it is a clashing of the swords. Then it kind of interprets how you. It's like this rippling effect throughout the interpretation of the effect book. While if you think about it as something that is maybe more chess-like, I believe is actually that Hilda and I were talking about it, and it's a kind of more of the terminology. Like I think that's a sword and buckler, kind of borrowing from the sword and buckler world. The idea that it's more the whole game is more chess-like, and actually, Joe just made the comment, the Lukukna material is probably a better longsword source than Messer source. I actually completely agree with that. But that is a subject maybe of next week's AMA. Because I'm thinking next week we're going to do a little slideshow of Messer, right? Some Messer stuff. I love it. Makes me happy. Yeah, so I think so like your approach to certain elements of the ciphering system can really affect how you translate and kind of interpret. You really interpret a lot of the materials from that point on. And there's something, and just for my interpretation, my study, and this is something I've constantly brought, especially why I particularly like the Yuda book, is a lot of. I feel like it's safer. A lot of the interpretations are safer because it's A, asking for you to end in a thrust, or B, setting up for a thrust. And because I guess I'm, especially considering what medical technology was at the time, fencing was far more dangerous, or at least in my humble opinion, uninformed opinion. And so why would you want to engage in something that was especially if you're a noble person, engage in something that was kind of beneath you, or engage in something that was very fast and very likely to get you injured. Kind of like it's kind of the argument that George Silver and Palladini both use about like future rapier systems, in which that the new Italians and French systems are getting all these people killed because they're not thinking, they're just dueling. So there's that kind of I don't know. So I'm kind of superimposing some of these biases on some of our interpretation of material. It'd be interesting to play around with, say, the Udalev or the Lukukna material, using unbinden as more of a at the crossing kind of thing. Which brings me quickly, and then I promise we'll kind of turn it around. I want to turn it around and kind of field questions and comments and just talk with y'all. But I guess the next question, and part of that, so that whole idea of unbinden leads to the question of what is defining häwen. And what is interesting, and I could not get the video to share because of it was the way that YouTube is running the whole copyright thing now. So häwen, as you know, frequently is like the hew, to hew out, to put out. I mostly talk about like hewing wood, so we mostly talk about this as like chopping, as cutting action. One could also possibly interpret it as something a little different. Still this action, but what's the point? What's the intention behind it? Especially if your sword's not optimized to cut, which we are working on some sword videos to talk about cutting optimization. That is some donation thing happened. Thank you, whoever that was. I missed the name. But yes. So like especially if your sword is not optimized to cut through dense material, to optimize the thrust, then there's other things to think about. And so what I'm thinking is not that I'm thinking, but one of the things that's interesting to play with is the idea of häwen as this idea of casting, right? still that cutting motion, still needs good cutting mechanics. And the idea of casting a sword out to position. Right? There's a really, really interesting video, the one that I wasn't able to share because of the YouTube copyright thing, and it is a really interesting video of a German axe, like wood cutting with axe hewing competition. and okay. Oh, right, and we're back. Okay. So one of the things. So again, so this video has these Germans competing in like cutting logs and chopping logs with these axes. These axes aren't huge, but the axe heads are only about yay big. But they're cutting these huge trees. And they just talk about how old it's this medieval kind of art of uninterrupted art of tree cutting, tree hewing with axes. So I'll pop in that link, and it's really interesting to watch. Their body mechanics are the actual tiny mechanics are very different, but you'll see a lot of structural similarities to kind of what we're doing, including the footedness, which is really interesting. Again, they are chopping into things with a device that's designed for chopping, but it's this action of casting down, casting and down, casting and down. So one must wonder if they're, again, we don't know how they. I am not an expert, and very few people are an expert in how the Germans were using language at the time. So it is very interesting to kind of try to interpret what they were saying, right? I think a lot of our idea of like, oh, häwen, sometimes might come from watching too many Star Wars or Game of Thrones, or First Night too many times or something, or Camelot. What's the one with the chrome armor from the 70s? I think, is it Excalibur? Maybe that's a good movie for movie night sometime. Anyway, so our interpretations can be kind of soiled by our interpretation or our preconceptions of what these things were for. So that we know that fencers were asked to approach with particular guards, but then how did they deploy them? So that's kind of part of the question. Which I think, again, that idea of how do you define häwen can send a complete recontextualization to kind of the system, right? Not saying the things are different. Crump how is still crump. Shield. These things are still the actions as described, but certain implementations might be altered. Some ideas of implementation. One of the things that I have kind of a side project going on, aside from my great job search, and also a project I can't quite talk about, but I might be producing a documentary, not related to sword things, go figure. Anywho, as I've been in touch with a university in Germany where they are putting together a medieval German dictionary. Not a lot of it is in English yet, and there's been some translation back and forth kind of things. Their English is very good and they're very nice people. But their entire research department is all about definitions of words, including especially those that still exist, and how they were used in medieval times. And I think this is very important because we often just kind of make assumptions about words when we see them in a document that we always automatically kind of key into what kind of what they are now or some variation on such. Like, for example, one thing that kind of led me down this rabbit hole. Put on your tinfoil hats, kids. Is the idea the word krump. Now, krump, crooked. Krump, how the crooked hue, right? But at the time, used so much as the word for crooked. It was used to mean heavy or hard. Like, and so, again, maybe I'm getting pedantic, but the idea of if it's not the crooked hew, and if it's the heavy hew, what does that do to our description? What does that do to our interpretation? Again, I'm just I think some interesting subjects to explore in the future. Um, it's something. Actually, I have a little set of things that once we have people together, safely behind masks, double masks. I have some experiments I'd like to run with y'all. I'd like to record them so we can share them with the internet. All right. So yeah. So I guess part 2 of this was just the idea of once I started researching unbinden, without sounding like too much like a rabbit hole tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, it kind of led me down this path of looking at words and the being maybe a little too pedantic on our translations and trying to see where, how were the Germans or the Germanic peoples of the time using these words. All right, so that's what I have for my little spiel. Which another word that has changed meaning over time, especially in German. So what I want to do now is for like the next half hour or so, just kind of hear your thoughts on any of that, anything you've experimented with lately, or in general, if you want tips, tricks, or just feedback on anything. Now's the time. I love to hear things. Dina says you definitely need to work with Lou on some stuff. I agree. I miss Lou. Lou, if you're watching, I miss you, buddy. We'll dance again soon. Let's see. While I'm waiting for questions to kind of come in, Joe Sarante says, häwen, or however you want to write it, is something a boar can do with its tusk. Joe, that sounds like a thrust to me. Oh, yeah, or casting out its tusk, yeah. Yeah, I think also like the idea of stier, the idea that stier and ox and Hug and Aba are kind of described in as animals or these devices that are meant for these certain actions. I would be interested to see what a medieval plow looks like, but I assume it's something that you're pushing. You're pushing in some way, be it up or out. But Aba is going to häwen. Stier is going to häwen. Such. There's some really great. There's actually books of the period, 14th, 15th century, 13th, 14th, 15th century books written by hunters and lords. I think at one point, maybe a king, that talked about how if you are going to practice for war, don't practice fencing, because it is not a good interpretation of war, but you need to go hunting, because hunting is lengthy process where it's dangerous and there are no rules, and it requires lots of planning and sieging of the animals from land and all that sort of thing. So the idea of using these animal metaphors, I really works in, and yeah. And let's see, and again, like, and I want to also be very, very clear that not all of the seeds, and I'm sure like people probably know this, like the idea that like um, are they come from it's like I'm trying to find the right way, but it's accumulation of knowledge from a variety of different sources, um, and like my teachers like Tristan and Corey, and then teachers like Jess Finley. Um, I've been able to pick a lot of brains and like ask a lot of questions, and I'm really lucky to have people that have done a lot of research on this stuff, and like, a lot of people like a lot of my comrades like Hildo and Dina and Pat and Josh and Joe and actually everyone pretty much in the Messer gang who are willing to put up with my shit. Um, like the idea of like uh, willing to experiment and discuss these things at length. All you lovable nerds. Josh says, makes sense. Hunting back then was a kill or be killed situation. Death isn't the goal in fencing. It's true. I don't even think death was often the goal in dueling. Probably, uh, but even if it was, there's still like rules and ways that you could do it. And I was reading somewhere that there's certain parts of certain areas where like dueling, like if you didn't duel correctly and you killed the other person, you were then held accountable. If you killed them incorrectly, unrightly, you were then held like in trial for murder, which oddly enough would sometimes result in another duel. There's a whole one of the Talhofer manuals. I forget which one. Talhofer and Paul's Call. There's a whole like chapter on the rules of the duel and how duels should be, if they're for game or for ernst, should be played out and what the rules are, and etc. 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 I'd like to take this pause and point out awesome sword rack made by Tristan Zukowski. It's going to be holding some wonderful weapons. Probably mostly Budo, but my messers will always have a place there. The woodwork on this thing is wonderful. My little sword corner over here. Let's see. Let's see. Justin M says hunting boar was no joke. People who hunt wild boar now with shotguns still find it stressful and dangerous. Oh yeah, Justin, have you seen the videos of the guys who do? They do. Um, uh, the guys who do medieval hunting, like they'll hunt wild boar with medieval technology. It is. It's a thing. It's graphic. This is coming from a vegetarian, so um, yeah, yeah. But it's really it's life or death. It's very horrifying. Katie M asks, you were talking about the danger inherent in dueling, especially in the Middle Ages. I'm curious how that balances out with social climate of honor and how commonplace street violence is. I was reading that something about Elizabeth in England, and while judicial dueling was rare, street violence was commonplace and to be expected. So there was a weird juxtaposition, seems to me. Yeah, I guess that's geography, and also I think weapons that were used for self-defense were probably weapons that were very, very different. I know that. Especially in, say, George Silver's time, which is a little like later than Lichtenauer, um, there was a big call to end dueling, and in fact, a lot even during the 14th century, throughout the 14th, 15th century, there was a lot of calling to end dueling, and In fact, there are some theories that have um, um, some theories that a lot of the reason we have the Lichtenauer Zettel is because of the fact that it was the bourgeois class putting together a set of rules under the auspice of like science. It is an art. It is a high art. It is a high science of fencing to kind of justify the practice of dueling. Um, and street violence, in terms of street violence, I think it is more likely that you would have to deal with that with a, say, single-handed sword or a messer or some other form of weapon or club or stick or something else, because or dagger is probably more likely to be existent in street violence, essentially because unless they're really rich, criminals probably don't, or exceedingly lucky, probably don't have a big sword or a sword at all, and so there are probably methods of self-defense that we're just not keen in, or maybe there's it's why I think there is a difference between like a kind of um, uh, practical application of Messer, which I think we find more in the Nuremberg tradition, in say and kind of the things that are related to that, such as the Glasgow manuscript and the Talhofer and the Paul's Call, is way more practical in terms of what it's trying to teach versus, say, the longsword materials. And in fact, if you look at some of the half sorting stuff, like the gloss half sorting in the Nuremberg thing, probably more realistic to certain things you might experience. Simply because, again, what you're going to be encountering in terms of street violence is going to be probably not a bunch of rich guys with their fancy long swords jacking you up. You know what I mean? Let's see. Justin says judicial dueling was much more common in early Middle Ages. One of the old ordeals that was used to determine innocence in Old Frankie. Oh. I can imagine that it began to fall out of favor. I think that's a big thing, and I think I think the church had a big part to do with that, and also a lot of just. I'm pretty sure it became disruptive, especially if you start having, you have your bourgeois class that you're very much trying to. Oh, sorry, I misread that. I don't have my glasses on. Sorry, Justin. Justin was talking about the areas of like France, Swiss, Germany. Um, uh, um, but like the idea, if you're trying to run a country and you have this bourgeois class, you probably don't want them going around killing each other all the time. Even though, as Justin says, supposedly God would assist someone who was truly innocent, elements of enlightenment maybe were trying to trickle in. Also, was honor as a concept in fighting mostly confined to nobility? I'd imagine there was plenty of honorless knaves in the streets, but I wonder what prevailing. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. Maybe. There is often society where you have a large discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, especially in medieval society where you have this bourgeois community and then you have a very proletariat community and almost none of the petit bourgeois, to the point where like there's going to be massive cultural differences between the societies in which they live, and so I wonder, especially because in nobility, like honor to a certain degree was probably had a different value than in kind of the proletariat life. Another ordeal was having to fetch something from a boiling pot, then seeing if you survived the burns by God's grace, for example. Ouch! Is that it's kind of like the witches thing, like put your hand in the boiling water. If you boil, you're guilty. You're a witch. We're gonna drown you. Good. If you drown, then you were innocent. But if you float, whoops, you gotta burn you anyway. So yeah, logic was not exactly their. You know what? I'm not even gonna. I am. Seeing it is 2020, I'm not even gonna judge them. Judge them. No, Justin, don't apologize. I think it's all. I think it all kind of paints a lot. It's all good. I'm not an expert in that stuff, um, and so I welcome. I welcome the information to kind of help paint the portrait of the time. While we're waiting for more questions and comments to roll in, over here, I just finished a great little book. It's a very, very fast read. I actually read it in it only took me a few hours to get through. It's called Ancient Swordplay. Actually, it's right here, so do excuse me. Here we go. Ancient Swordplay. I highly recommend it if you do Hema, because it is the revival of Elizabethan fencing in Victorian London. It's a fun read. It is about essentially the original Hema hipsters. It is all about Alfred Hutton and Egerton Castle. Let me read you the brief here. Ancient swordplay. In late Victorian England, even as the sword was being rendered useless on the battlefield, swordsmanship was experiencing a unique revival. Captain Alfred Hutton and Egerton Castle, both devoted fencers and amateur historians, led a systematic study and reconstruction of combat with all the weapons of Elizabethan arsenal. The elegant rapier, the deadly sword and buckler, and the massive two-handed sword. Their work found practical expression in classes, exhibitions, academic lectures, and theatrical combat for audiences diverse as schoolchildren, soldiers, and Prince of Wales. It is a really interesting exploration of the original Hema nerds. It is fascinating how much things have not changed. There's a bunch of amateur historians who like swords and kind of got into it. There's a little bit of drama between different fencing schools or people who think different types of fencing should be taught. There's some really great photos in it. There's some really great images in it. And what's really fun is it really, really talks about how they tried to start all these fencing schools. There's always starting of fencing schools and kind of why it went away. I'm not going to spoil. I'll go spoil it a little bit. World War I had a lot to do with. There was such drama. Like they're writing letters to the local paper and different magazine distributions, talking about like the equivalent of smack. It was the equivalent of what were the albums that the hip hop artists would put out to kind of shit on each other. So there was that all that crazy, wonderful stuff going on. But oddly, it wasn't the crazy smack talk that actually ended up kind of phasing everything out. World War I, for two reasons, was a big reason for a lot of swordplay and fencing. In fact, fencing, even as a Olympic sport, almost went away after World War I. There was a lot of argument whether or not it should even be included, because aside from the fact that World War I was a fucking nightmare, and a lot of people that were of the age to be doing these things died. A lot of people that were doing them died. And military folk saw the swords were cavalry swords were not really going to stand up against mustard gas machine guns. So there was a military reason, tactical reason to kind of phase them out. But also, there was a big push after World War I. People really, truly thought the Great War was the war to end all wars. And at least in the West, there was this idea that violence should be frowned upon to a certain degree, or violent sport should be frowned upon. And of course, that slowly dissipated as the politics of the time became more reality.